Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-followed and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Time once again, Charles, to exchange some ideas, which I always look forward to. Any key new thoughts in your recent writings that you want to share with our listeners before we start?
No, I'm just really excited about our topic of mercantilism because I think it's an underappreciated dynamic, and that's going to be hugely consequential going forward.
And you've been writing about this in various forms for a long time now, so hopefully we can consolidate a lot of your previous thinking into what really the subject we have at hand here today that we've laid out together. Charles, as I normally do, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends we're identifying and simply make the discussions available to the public for those who might be interested or want to contribute comments, which we truly welcome, read, and value. Over the years, the subjects Charles and I discuss in these macroanalytic videos often take a few years to evolve. However, after doing these for, I guess, well over 10 years now, Charles, I think we both can say with certainty that seldom have they not happened. But as you might expect, our expectations turn out slightly different, however, and always take longer than we expect. I therefore think today's discussion will be no different, though as you will see, much of what we will talk about is actually occurring now in some ways a stealth fashion, but is blatant if you're really paying attention and watching. It's like a secret in broad daylight that's occurring, and I'll explain that a little later. I'm showing here the agenda we hope to cover with the assistance of about 30 slides. Any comments generally before we begin, Charles?
No. I'm looking forward to this discussion and how we're going to tie in a bunch of different dynamics, including interest rates, commodity prices, geopolitics.
This session is actually going to be a direct follow-on to our last session, which was entitled "The Dam Has Broken." In that session, we covered the key ideas shown here. If you haven't seen the video, I encourage you to view it, but it is our intent here to build on it rather than repeat much of the content. Charles, I suspect for those who haven't seen the video, the only caption not self-explanatory here is the word degrowth, which is going to be important in our discussion here this morning. Could you describe very briefly what you meant by that when you actually wrote the book on exactly that subject?
Right. Thank you, Gordon. And degrowth has been around since the late 70s as a word. It was from the French word décroissance. And so it has a lot of people talk about it in various ways. And so there is no one definition, that works for everybody. But the general idea is that we could waste resources when they were cheap and abundant. And now that they're not cheap and abundant anymore, then we can't really waste them. We have to move from a sort of what I call the landfill economy, where planned obsolescence, everything breaks and you throw it away and you buy a new one, and that's how we get a growth in GDP. We have to move from that model to like smart growth, meaning we have to invest in rather than just like squander resources. We have to invest to use them more efficiently, more wisely. And so that's what I think of as degrowth. And that's going to require a big shift in our thinking and how we measure prosperity, because prosperity isn't going to be coming from wasting resources like it was when they were cheap and abundant for the last 75 years. It's going to come from smart investing in efficiency and getting more out of those resources and more out of capital and labor. We're going to have to go back to increasing our productivity rather than just borrowing money and blowing it and calling that growth.
To give a clearer context of how and why these subjects listed here and Charles' comment on degrowth is unfolding, it is important to start, in my opinion, with a historical evolution that's been ongoing here, and an evolution of global mercantilism, an evolution that has went through four, in my mind, or at least I've defined it, and Charles, I think you agree, four important evolutionary stages over the last 400 years or so. The first stage shown here was one of imperial feudalism. During this stage, the great imperial naval powers of England and France, Spain, Germany, and the Dutch captured land around the world and established them as colonies. These colonies offered wealth to the great powers through their natural resources. Resources highly sought after, like gold, silver, gems, furs, as well as all manner of food types, from vegetables and fruits to coffees and cocoa, and additionally minerals, metals, and raw materials for building, like timber for the great naval fleets. I'll call this what we refer to today as trade of commodities. The colonies supplied the commodities and unskilled labor in return for the most basic needs at that time, like axes and shovels and other items produced by the imperial powers, at that time beginning to fully industrialize themselves. And the imperial powers added nothing more than capital and value in the form of production to create massive wealth for themselves. The rich got richer, but the poor just stayed poor. The first real change to this rudimentary, what we today call a supply chain, that time very rudimentary, was with Japan, and subsequently what we then called the Asian Tigers in the 1980s and the 1990s. Japan changed the global landscape. By this time, the U.S. was the dominant industrial global power and manufacturer to the world. World War I and World War II had accelerated this consolidation of power through establishing the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency, as well as the U.S.'s innovation in creating value add in manufacturing. But Japan's mercantile strategy was simple, but it was incredibly powerful. It would build exactly what the U.S. was producing, but do it cheaper. Japan had cheaper and larger labor force that could be mobilized to do this. And the real sustaining power underneath this was different, and it was twofold. One, Japan used its currency for competitive advantage, always keeping it lower and making it difficult for the U.S. to compete globally on price. Incredibly more significantly, but least understood, Japan took its dramatically increasing wealth and then bought U.S. Treasury debt securities with it. It took all the money it was getting and sent it right back to the United States, specifically to buy U.S. Treasury debt. And by doing this, what it did is it drove U.S. interest rates down and allowed U.S. consumers to cheaply finance even more cheap Japanese products. And the longer term result of this has become, even after Japan has lost its leadership role, is the U.S. became the largest consumption economy in the world with nearly a 70% consumption GDP dependency. And after a crippling stagflation of the 70s and taking itself off the gold standard, the U.S. didn't respond to the Japanese threat and was glad to have a buyer of its ever-increasing debt and fiscal deficits. It did, however, mark a period of the beginning of the U.S. policies of offering tremendous amounts of foreign aid to maintain some form of control and relationship with these global commodity suppliers. And we'll get back to the structural issues today with that foreign aid in a little later as we go on from it, but it was at that point that it really started to be a tool for U.S. foreign policy. Any comments so far, Charles?
Yeah, I'd like to again, using your idea of let's go back to the fundamentals of global capitalism. This thing about mercantilism is a new twist on an old idea, which the economist Ricardo had written about, which was called comparative advantage. And the idea was that if Portugal could grow grapes and make good wine at a much lower price than Scotland, then naturally it would make sense for Portugal to ship its low-cost good wine to Scotland, and for Scotland to ship whatever it had, wool products or something like that to Portugal. And so it was supposed to be like a win-win thing, and it just makes common sense, right? But mercantilism is different than that. It's not just a comparative advantage. The governments of mercantilist economies like Japan, China, Germany, they specifically target exports as the source of their economic growth and prosperity. They subsidize their export industries through a myriad of ways that many of them are hidden. And like Japan is a master of um, blocking or creating obstacles for imports, right? And a lot of them are they'll spend years saying, "Oh, the product, we're not sure it's safe or something," and the product is like an electric guitar, you know. And so the mercantilist economies are actually designed and they're optimized for benefiting their own economies by these mechanisms that you've described. You know, in other words, they target exports as the source of their prosperity, and so they will go in and plan to decimate a domestic production in their target countries. And so Japan was also a master of this, and other people have copied it. Which is, you know, Japan would go into the U.S. and it would target an industry, and it would sell under way under the price that U.S. Companies could produce at. And then once they destroyed the U.S. domestic production, then they would jack up their price because they created a cartel or a monopoly. And so these are not this is a different structure. And when the post-war era began, post World War II, the U.S. was, as you say, the dominant production and also sort of source of wealth, if you will. And so the mercantilist economies got rich by targeting selling to America, right? And America at the time was in a Cold War. There was a geopolitical conflict with the Soviet Union. And so the U.S. consciously chose mercantilism to support this rather than fight Germany and Japan, being mercantilist and taking advantage of that. Then the U.S. accepted this as the price to make Japan and Germany prosperous nations. And by Germany, I mean the leader of the European community, right? Of course, other European economies benefited by mercantilist policies as well, right? So now the world has changed, and mercantilism, you're not going to get rich trying to sell consumer products to the U.S. anymore for all the reasons we've talked about. So now what we're talking about here is a shift from selling consumer goods to the U.S. as the way to make money to starting to control the commodities that are the source of all global prosperity.
Exactly. The next major shift, stage 3, was the entry of China into the World Trade Organization in 2002, and they took it to a whole new level. China initially simply out-Japanned the Japanese with some decided further competitive advantages, and China used its currency for advantage, and like Japan, also bought U.S. treasuries with its exploding FX reserves. Japan and China to this day are by far the largest holders now of U.S. debt. Without them, the U.S. has a massive problem in financing and rolling over its debt. They are the holders and bankers to the U.S. mountain of debt. And what China added to its involvement was unfair trade. And as a communist country, China chose to use state-owned or financed companies to gain competitive price advantage. You heard Charles describe how Japan did it, but they were independent companies operating their own. These are state-owned companies that can price anything that they want if they're giving unlimited resources. They're called SOEs, or state-owned enterprises. So selling products as a loss, similar to Japan, to gain market footholds, then increasing market share, was added in a whole new dimension to the portfolio of weapons to change the global mercantilism for the third major time. Other major global exporters, like, as Charles mentioned, North Korea and Germany, had to also adapt strategies to continue to maintain their competitiveness against Japan and China. Any comments here, Charles, at China's difference?
Right. It's a great topic, and as you say, it's a global shift. And of course, China had an enormous pool of low cost labor, right? And it had a huge market. The global market for cheap consumer goods was large when China began industrializing, because interest rates were low, right? And the price of oil and other essential commodities was also low. So China entered the global economy at just the right moment. And so there was enough commodities to fuel its enormous boom. The other thing I want to mention is you touched on it here, that the whole thing of controlling the value of your currency is part of your weaponization of mercantilism. And of course, China has used a peg to the US dollar. And in other words, it's not global market forces that decide the value of the yuan or the RMB versus the dollar and other currencies. The Chinese state sets the peg. And so, again, just to follow on your point, that mercantilism is all about controlling your currency, because if your currency, is creates lower cost products in your target economies, then of course that's a huge advantage that your target, your competition can't match, because their currency is just worth more than your currency. And so currency manipulation, if you will, is a key to mercantilism, and it's part of what you and I see as unraveling. That dynamic is changing, and there's a lot more fragmentation than there was. And one last point about mercantilism and China's sort of perfection of the Japanese mercantilist model is they're buying bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds, to enable kind of like the pusher and the addict, right? That the U.S. is addicted to low interest rates to fund excessive consumption, and so they're the pusher that enables the addict to keep buying by keeping our interest rates low. But they're also buying real estate and enterprises, and that becomes a national security issue. In other words, we've transferred a huge amount of wealth to the mercantilist economies, who then have the capital to go and start snapping up our resources. And so there's a geopolitical tension here that is new, and I think it's very consequential. That it's now, this whole mercantilist model is now a national security issue as well.
Precisely. We're now in the midst of the beginning of phase 4, which we have termed here as revalued mercantilism. And the impact of supply chain problems in the post-COVID lockdown period has ushered in some profound changes in thinking around the world regarding risk. Attitudes have emerged towards reshoring, de-globalization, de-financialization. The value and importance of commodities has now taken on center stage with shortages and lack of supply and time to market. So commodities have increasingly become real collateral in trade financing. Commodities as hard assets are increasingly becoming money, which is giving greater power to what is, again, increasingly becoming what I'm now calling the southern nations versus emerging markets. Developed markets are developed markets because they historically controlled the supply chains. If the southern nations made what they needed, they wouldn't be emerging markets. Yet if developed markets now don't make what they need, how do they expect to stay developed markets? Just by making the economic rules? What if others say no? So ask yourself that as Russia turns off the gas taps to Europe to try to force them to drop sanctions, as the U.S. Freeport LNG terminal says it will be out for 90 days, not 21 days. So EU gas prices soar, more inflation, more balance of payment deficits, and less room for the ECB policy maneuvers. The post-1945 global institutions the West created in all their double standard glory are not the source of Western power. Western power is the source of the institutions with the double standard glory. Indeed, arguably, the real difference between developed and emerging markets is that sovereign is he who decides on the exceptions. And that concept matters more than markets want. There is now open pushback against the global system from those providing key input into it. The West either pushes back or gets pushed off the stage in this new multipolar world we now have. And it's likely to be the former. Charles, do you want to jump in here and talk about why revaluing mercantilism will happen and has already begun on this slide?
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. My point here is in our topic of revaluing mercantilism is that um, mercantilism is no longer the source of prosperity that it was for the last, say, 75 years. In other words, we see this in the stagnation of Japan for the last 20 plus years. We see this now in slowing growth in China. In other words, China sort of maxed out the mercantilist model, and now it's entering the same kind of stagnation that other countries are experiencing. And so this means that if you want to prosper as a nation, then you're going to have to start acquiring or accessing the commodities that are the true source of prosperity. And so for 75 years, the global economy was dominated by finance, one form of finance or another. And we call this financialization, which is the expansion of credit, manipulating interest rates to keep them low, and being able to buy commodities with money that you created or borrowed into existence. Now that structure is crumbling because for all the reasons that we're discussing now. So the source of growth is not going to be devaluing your currency and trying to sell consumer goods to somebody else. It's going to be acquiring the commodities your economy needs to survive.
But I want to shift gears, if we could, Charles, on that theme. But let's talk about what I've referred to as the southern countries here earlier, or what I've often now termed emerging markets. Just to put it into real perspective here, the massive size of this. We have approximately 138 countries, or 3/4 of all nations on the planet, economically dependent on the export of commodities as their primary and often sole economic support. In many ways, they have been held as feudal economic slaves of old through Western pricing and the vagrancies of the controllers of the futures markets. 28% of these countries are dominated by fuel exports, which is now a serious issue, 27% by metals, minerals, and organic products, and 19% by food and produce. And we are all well aware that we're facing a serious global food shortage problem going into this year and next year, not just because of fertilizers and not just because of crop failures and climate, but a whole raft of economic investment kinds of issues. And this is a major problem. The bloc itself of countries, a bloc that has become organized, like unions that organize to change the industrial era to better serve the downtrodden worker. The prime organizers have been the BRIC nations, and the BRIC standing for Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and includes also South Africa. But these nations, led by China and Russia, they have created organizations such as China's Road and Belt Initiative, and organized countries around it, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, and a broad range of African trade agreements, which have strengthened and unified them on multiple fronts now as highly organized, structured, with goals in mind and how they're going to improve their economies at an accelerating rate. And increasingly, they become more important, as we've already seen with the fallout of the Ukraine war, Russian sanctions, global food and energy shortages here just in the last 3 to 4 months. And we're seeing it with commodity prices literally skyrocketing. It's an era of control is right around the corner from them through allocations, trading restrictions, quotas, soon appearing, in my mind, to be on the horizon. And commodity players are becoming powerful, and commodities are becoming real money, not fiat currencies, when shortages and scarcities soon will dominate. Comments on that, Charles?
Yeah, I think you've described very succinctly the core dynamic going forward, and it ties into something I've been writing about for the last decade, which I call neo-colonialism, which is that the West substituted financialization as the method of controlling the supply chains of commodities. In other words, you offered the commodities supplying nations cheap credit, and you got them indebted, and then you controlled them through the debt or by purchasing the assets of their domestic economy on the cheap, right? And then you control the mines and the agricultural land and so on directly. So this model of using financialization to control commodities is breaking down for all the reasons you've described. And so financialization is not going to be the only dynamic in play here. And I think we're going to see a lot of national security and geopolitical issues arise where nations might expropriate foreign-owned assets. For example, they will simply grab back assets that were purchased in the era of financialization. And you're going to talk about that in the next topic here, which is China's road initiative.
That's the track that they're on and have planned it. We know there's a conflict brewing and in full out between China's desires to be the global leader and the West, led by the U.S. And we're seeing it getting to be more confrontational. I say that in terms of the issues with Taiwan and the South China Sea, but it's more than that. And China have done a masterful job over the last 8 or 9 years of setting the pins in place. And it's a whole thing about following the money. And so we need to fully appreciate some of the real muscle behind this evolution and why it's just not an academic discussion. It's real. And that is the appreciation comes with a better understanding of what this China Belt and Road Initiative really is and what it's all about and what it's aimed at. It isn't just increasing trade. It's about control and how. I mentioned earlier the U.S. policy towards foreign aid to emerging markets. And we need to contrast what was the U.S. approach, still is, and China's BRI. And that's the Belt and Road Initiative. Let me just call it the BRI. So when the U.S. gave or gives foreign aid, what it is doing is it's guaranteeing money that will be lent as foreign aid. The U.S. doesn't lend the money. It is an unsecured loan to the nation. The banks actually lend the money knowing full well that the U.S. is guaranteeing default risk. And the U.S., from an accounting standpoint, what we call it is contingent liabilities. It's off balance sheet and not part of the reported U.S. debt. It doesn't become debt unless the foreign aid loan is defaulted on by the nation and can't pay the bank. And the bank just says, U.S., here's what you owe, and that debt becomes due and payable. And if that into perspective, the U.S. currently has what is termed a fiscal gap of well over 220 trillion, at least as reported in the last update to Congress. This is a massive exposure with nothing stopping default. If these nations had access to other credit that a U.S. default wouldn't actually jeopardize, and that's what's now happening. And if they do default, it goes right onto our balance sheet and we have to pay up. It's somehow got to be financed. And I say 220 trillion. I suspect that's well north of 300 trillion. It's a number that very few people can get access to. The local professor here in Boston, Kutlikoff, actually presented it to Congress a number of years ago and proved exactly what it was. And the Congress themselves were stunned to know what commitments they'd really made. The China, on the other hand, the BRI, is structured completely differently. So it is secured loan from the Chinese-owned lenders with controlled loans and covenants with the CCP. So China is now a rigid lender to the bulk of these nations and effectively increasingly controls all these southern nations. They have the covenants. They have the control when anybody defaults to come in, step in, and decide how they're going to settle the loan and what comes with that settlement. And a recent report really, to me, shed light on just really how massive this is, because there's over 14,000 developed projects underway across these nations shown here in this slide as part of the BRI. The loans are well north of $1 trillion, making, frankly, U.S. foreign aid look like small change now in comparison. Shown here in this slide is the BRI borrower, and it's pretty good representation of the developed economies versus the rest of the world and emerging markets. And shown here is the Chinese-funded BR projects underway by transaction size as last reported in 2021. But I found this chart, Charles, to be the most telling chart. What it shows is the suspensions and cancellations by transaction amount of all countries. countries who found themselves in default and now have to make amends to the Chinese lenders that have lent their money with the covenants. These are countries with debt obligations payable under the terms of those loans to China, and nobody knows what they are. So what these countries are forced to do or surrender to satisfy their Chinese creditors, we can only imagine. This is real power and influence. And China has thought it through on how they're all approach to debt issuance. So I expect U.S. foreign aid defaults to soon occur, and the U.S. to potentially suddenly face exploding contingent liability events, because this is direct debt that the U.S., as I said, will now have to finance as part of its increasing fiscal debt. If the Chinese are going to lend them the money, they don't care if the credit rating goes down because they've got the capital, and especially if they've got no choice dictated by China. China now is not only the biggest lender with Japan to the United States in our normal debt, but now is in actual control of everything but the unfunded liability in this country. That is the fiscal gap. They have become our bankers, and with it control. We just haven't understood how much yet. And everyone says the U.S. debt is approximately $30 trillion, which is seen to be out of control, but it isn't. That's because, as I said, it doesn't include unfunded liabilities of $94 trillion associated with Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and various disabilities, but also this contingent liability event. It is massive, and it is like a ticking time bomb of control right in front of us. And how is the U.S. going to finance any of this going forward? China is the creditor here and will no doubt soon be dictating, potentially, depending on what we do, to the U.S. So what are our conclusions here? Charles, you want to step us through what we concluded from this?
Yeah, I think the your slide here is the mercantile revaluing, and again, I think the proper contextualization for this changing of the global economy and the source of value is the shift from finance to actual commodities and political issues, geopolitical and politics, because every nation has to do whatever it takes to supply its populace with essentials such as fuel and food, right? And so that's not an option. If your populace starts getting hungry and getting cold in winter, then your government is at risk of being overthrown, right? So politics will now dominate finance, and that's new. We always knew that politics was important in geopolitics, but now they will become the core issue. And so what we're seeing is a revaluing of income streams, like what's making the real money here. Is it producing consumer goods, or is it getting control of commodities? And we're basically saying it's getting control of commodities that's going to be the real value proposition here. We're revaluing risk, because what happens when supply chains, which I call dependency chains, when long supply chains that are optimized for just-in-time delivery break down, you've got a whole raft of risks to your economy that haven't been priced in yet. I also have to mention that globally, labor has been falling behind in terms of purchasing power for 45 years. And so now labor globally, not just in the US, but around the world, including China, is now demanding a bigger piece of the pie as the means to survive. I mean, if you don't make enough money to pay for essentials, then that's a political problem, not just a financial one. And so then the geopolitical risks we barely even touched, but we can see that the world is now fragmenting, and it's in pushback mode, and the competing blocks are shifting. It isn't just the good old days of a binary Cold War between the Soviet Union and the U.S. Now we have China, we have Russia and the BRIC countries. We've got the U.S. and the West and the southern nations. I mean, all of these blocks are actively competing against each other. It's not just a simple equation now. And so we've talked about the fourth turning in the past, and it's basically a model where there's periods of stability and cooperation, and those decay into periods of crisis and conflict. And we're entering that that long cycle phase of conflict destabilization. And in my view, the survivors, the nations that will not just pull through but actually start prospering, will be those that embrace degrowth rather than try to race to the bottom by devaluing their currency and or inflating their currency away and reducing the purchasing power of wages. All those things are a race to the bottom. So there is another model, and that's the model which I'm calling degrowth, but which is, let's just call it smart growth. And so that's going to be the national choice every nation's going to have to make or not. And so that's where I think we're going.
People often asking me that with a sense that everything is so chaotic, nothing seems to pass the common sense test. I feel senses of frustrations in their questions from how to invest, etc. And it's because we're in this massive change that's underway, and it's hard for people to really see and understand the change and put it into some context of which they can frame individual things that are happening and what they really mean and what's driving behind the scenes. And hopefully, Charles, what we've succeeded in this session here today, to try and distill as quickly as possible a perspective of what is actually going on. And it is a core, and it's a massive and significant structural change in the world economy. And it's basically because we've lived in a unipolar world for decades now, and we've had stability, unprecedented stability around the world since the Second World War, other than some skirmishes here with what we call the Cold War, which was exactly that, skirmishes. But we've had unprecedented stability. Well, that's not the way the world has ever worked. It's always been in continuous change. And we're in the midst of another massive and major structural change in the world. And what it'll do is it will change institutions, it'll change money, it'll change what has been practices in investing and how it's invested. It's changing what the basis of money is. And that's what we're talking about today. Is it going to happen tomorrow? No, but it's happening. And so hopefully we've given you that framework. And I'm showing here so if you want to do more reading, this isn't just Charles and our opinions and our research and what we're seeing. There's a lot of very, very bright people. I'm listing just some of them here with completely different backgrounds who are coming out of the same holes as we are with what is really going on, with different views of it, whether it's financial, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's cultural, that all play in here. And there's a lot of books that are now starting to be written to spell that out. So I encourage you to really begin to delve into that and look at it. Any closing comments, Charles, that we haven't touched on that need to be brought up?
Yeah, I just want to mention my book, Global Crisis, National Renewal, which you have a nice slide here for me, which just is talking about this rebalancing, degrowth, reshoring, definancialization, deglobalization. And I just want to mention that, the U.S., as we've discussed here, has tremendous disadvantages here. And it's loaded itself up with a lot of dysfunctional financial systems. But the world we're entering now of commodity control and scarcity, there will be advantages to economies that are balanced, that have commodities, and they have an industrial base, and they have a stable financial system. Those balanced economies will be in a better place for smart growth than economies that are largely dependent on one segment, whether it be commodities or industrialized production. And so North America, for better or for worse, has a lot of commodities still, and it has agricultural production, and it has an industrial base. And so I wouldn't count the U.S. out here. It's all I'm saying. And we're not trying to say that we favor a solution or another. I'm simply pointing out that any economy that has a more balanced economy with some commodities and some production and a stable financial system, and the willingness to adapt and evolve and innovate, those economies are the ones you want to bet on. Now, some people think that's China, some people think it's the US, some people think it's Brazil. Whatever your analysis is, those I think are the dynamics that are going to favor smart investing.
Exactly right. And I personally, Charles, don't believe there's any place that has more natural and balanced position in commodities, agriculture, labor force, education, etc., than right here in North America. So I put my stamp that the good times for America, Canada, are still in the future. But between the future and now, there's going to be some very serious turmoil because we don't have everything right, nor are we close to it in North America. And there's going to have to be some major realignment to sustain and take advantage of that, all those natural resources that God blessed us with. We're up against our hard line. We have to break here, Charles. So until we meet again, all the best, and we'll talk later.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon.
Talk to you later. Bye.